Okay, the next session is going to focus on valuing dental practices. I'm very pleased to welcome back James Kelley. James Kelley spoke to us before and did an excellent job. He educated us a lot on valuing dental practices, and he'll do so again today. James Kelley is a director at Tavola Group. He's a graduate of San Diego State University, where he earned his bachelor's degree in accounting and master's degree in information systems. He has over 20 years of experience as a CPA, work in accounting, management, systems design, and analytics. So, James, we'll turn the session over to you.
Thanks very much, David. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, can we get my PowerPoint up?
Mark, can you get that?
Yes, we can share now the screen.
Oh, okay. Give me 1 second. I apologize. All right. I think I might have flipped the screens. Give me 1 second. There we go. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me back, and thank you for having me in the first place. I'm going to jump right in. So most of this is going to concentrate on kind of the stage of preparing to sell your dental practice. This starts pretty much as early as you can possibly start it. We'll get to why that's important later. I'm going to start with running you through some common valuation methods, just quick hits on each type, valuation versus sales price, succession planning, and then we're going to talk a little bit about metrics, and we'll do a little bit of Q&A. So the first and probably most common valuation method that is used in any business, including dental, is going to be the DCF model, or discounted cash flow. Real basic, it estimates the value of a business by using future growth, future sales, and adjusts it all back to today's dollars. The pros of it are that it values it on actual cash flow rather than accounting profits, and it can be adapted to many different business scenarios and all types of businesses. One of the cons is that it does require accurate forecasting of future cash flows. Something important to note is that all valuations are based on future value, not current or not past. The current or past is the starting point, but that's what makes valuation work difficult in the first place, and valuing firms for the future difficult is because we're trying to predict the future. Also, small changes in assumptions like the growth rate or discount rate within the model can lead to huge differences in evaluation. As an example, if your average growth rate for the last 3 years is 5%, and suddenly you see a spike and you of like 30-40% for a year, and you decide to use that for your DCF model, the result of that valuation is going to be hugely different than if you averaged out or smoothed out that growth rate. So it's important to understand the inputs that you're putting into the model. Next one.
James, may I ask you a question about that? What do you do in terms of terminal value?
Terminal value is, I mean, whether you're using terminal value or not, it's all going to be discounted back. So it depends. It depends on the situation for what it calls for. We usually run a couple different scenarios on each valuation. So that's unfortunately, that's my answer on that one. It really depends on the situation.
Okay.
Capitalized earnings is the next one. This is a more simple model, and it's super easy to calculate, focuses completely on profitability. It's your annual earnings divided by capitalization rate. The issues with it is that finding the capitalization rate can be a sensitive subject, getting the correct rate to use. And it also doesn't account for any future growth. I prefer DCF model over this, but his capitalized earnings is also very easy to calculate, so it's a common model as well. And then the last one we'll quickly talk about is a market approach. Again, this is not so much a model as this is comparative to selling a house. And it's looking at actual market data. It's very easy to understand. And you're looking at actual sales for practices. The challenge here is that private companies typically don't report their sales. So a lot of the comparables are going to end up being larger public companies. And they don't necessarily translate very well over to the kind of valuations that smaller dental practices, even with multiple locations, do because of just the mass size difference. And much like the housing market, the data can become very quickly outdated. And you really do have to concentrate on finding a comparable company, not just one within the same industry. As an example, you could be trying to sell an orthopedic or a dental practice for kids, and maybe you can't find a dental practice for kids as a comparable. So that's the challenge on that one. Any questions on that specifically, David?
Yeah. To what extent does geography matter, or big city versus rural? So even if you could find comparables, let's say your business that you're trying to sell is in San Diego, and your comparables in Buffalo, New York, would you look at making adjustments?
Yeah, you'd probably want to adjust the sales, and definitely the size of the market is going to make a huge impact on the value of the business. Just considering potential growth in, say, San Diego versus a small city in Tennessee. That geography definitely makes a difference. I think your comparable is more your starting point before you start adjusting for things like that. There's also something to be said that there's probably a lack of marketability in a small city versus a larger city, so that maybe your dental practice, even doing a similar amount of sales than a company in a larger city, might be worth less because there's less room for growth in those smaller locations.
Are there statistics available that one can purchase that indicate the concentration of dentists in a geographical area? So, maybe there's so many dentists in San Diego that the average addressable population per dentist is actually lower in San Diego than in Buffalo, New York. Can one find that kind of data?
I think you could definitely find that kind of data. Off the top of my head, I don't know who would be selling that, but that seems like something that would be pretty easy to find. One, because dental licenses are public, so you could easily find out in a state or specifically a smaller city how many dentists are in practice. I think there'd be plenty of ways to find that kind of data. That's actually a great point. Okay, something to be said. I think this is a common misunderstanding that once you get to your valuation, that's going to be the price that your practice sells for. So this really piggybacks on what we were just talking about as far as comparables go. So when you do get your valuation, understand that it's more a starting point at it for negotiation, and not necessarily the sales price or the market rate. Market conditions can change your valuation to transferring over to a sales price. Synergies of the company purchasing you, if a larger company is purchasing you or a multi-practice company is purchasing you, maybe you're more valuable to them as a standalone practice because of the stuff that they already have, and you're kind of the missing piece. Versus, another single practice is buying you, and you're not quite as valuable to them as you were to the larger group. Also looking at stuff which we'll address when we talk about metrics and planning is risks like key man risks or patient retention. One of the big things with dental practices, as I'm sure everybody knows, is the trust that you have in your dentist. And that's what keeps you coming back. And if the transition isn't done correctly, you have a huge potential for losing quite a few of those patients in the transfer to the new owner. Also, payment structures can change the valuation or the sales price. So if you're doing an owner financed note versus a SBA loan. Those can be good negotiating points for lowering or raising the sales price because they may be more risky or less risky for the person buying the practice. Succession planning is extremely important. So, like I was saying, patients typically stay with a dental provider because they trust them, probably more than any other service. Even I think medical doctors, definitely more than accountants or tax people. I think it's important to have a level of trust with your dental provider. I know for me personally, I stayed with the same dental provider until I moved out of the city I was living in, because I trusted him implicitly. You're having someone put their hands in your mouth and give you advice on your health. I think that's a huge point, right? So one of the bigger risks in selling your practice is that if you don't treat the transition correctly, or the transition period's too short, that your patient retention is going to suffer. And depending on how the deal is structured, a lot of times dental practice sales are structured on a buyout or a period of time where the patient retention is measured. That you could end up lowering your selling price or lowering the amount of money overall that you take home. So a careful transition with deliberate planning and starting as soon as you possibly can. So once you decide to sell your practice, getting that person in and having them start working at your practice and transitioning, if that's how you choose to transition, is incredibly important. It makes it a lot smoother, and just in general, it'll be more healthy for your bottom line when you're selling it.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
You correct me if you disagree, but just my personal experiences, I've seen situations where there's a lot of double key man risks, double succession planning risks. In several cases, the spouse of the dentist manages the office, or in one case, it was the mother. And I'd imagine in almost all those cases, both of the couples would leave together, and so then you don't have the practitioner doing the work, and you don't have a really good office manager. Anyway, I mean, that's something I've seen.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It really depends. I mean, key man risk could be 3 or 4 people for that matter. It could be a group of people that the dental practice is run a certain way. I mean, this is true for pretty much any type of service company, that you have the key person that is maybe performing the procedures, and you also have the person that's actually dealing directly with, say, the payments or the payment plans, or directly with appointments with the customers. That you're absolutely right. Again, even that needs to be planned for. If you do have a spouse or an employee that maybe isn't staying, that needs to be part of your transition planning as well. I think all of that kind of goes in. I think a lot of times, if it's not a spouse, most people tend to stay even when a practice does transition to a new dentist, but definitely not in all cases.
I guess the more subtle the transition, the higher probability you're keeping.
Yeah, and dental practices, because if you're a single location, almost all single locations are going to have some sort of a key man risk. I think it just depends on how many people that you're talking about to determine what you do. Let's move into a little metrics. These are more kind of just as a start. So one of the big tips I give for anybody that's starting metrics, this is if you've not looked at anything ever, or maybe you have too many metrics that you're looking at right now and it seems overwhelming. Keep it simple. You want to keep all of your KPI tracking simple. You can always add later, but you don't want to start out with 35 different things that you're looking at on a monthly or weekly basis. You're going to get overwhelmed, and a lot of times what happens is people simply stop looking at their KPIs because there's just too many of them. So as a start, and we can definitely talk about more that you could do, some of them are going to be custom to your particular practice, is as a start, you want to start with payer characteristics. Always good to know what percentage of your patients are on private pay, insurance, private financing, or some sort of mix between those. I'm sure a lot of people use their insurance up to the max, and then they private pay the rest, or they use care credit or some other form of financing. That's one. Care credit costs dental practices money. In depending on which deal is chosen. So that's important to know your cost structure on that part of it. A service breakdown. This is really good to be looking at when you are doing evaluation on your company, knowing how much of your service revenue is for reoccurring revenue. So preventative care, I would say, is the main reoccurring revenue that you want to be looking at. So it is good to break those up between elective, emergency, preventative care, so you can do proper forecasting. And then one that I don't see a lot of dental practices use, at least I hadn't a couple years ago, I don't know if this has changed, but is your capacity. This speaks more to your dental office's growth potential, and it's how much total chair time you have available and how much is being used. So you could break it down further by how many doctors you have on staff, or how many dental hygienists you have on staff, along with the chair time or rooms or specialist time, specialist chairs. I think this one is kind of coming over from a manufacturing environment where you're trying to see what your max output is for your dental practice in the first place. I don't think that's super common. David, do you have any questions specifically on metrics?
I'm not sure it goes in here specifically, but usually multiples rise the bigger the enterprise is. The more revenue, the higher the multiple you get. Do you see that? Or is it more a function of the more dentists you have, the more value, or the more facilities, or the more rooms, examination rooms you have? Anything about multiple rising when the business is bigger?
Revenue is generally the main driver of multiple ranges going up. So at the lower end of multiples is usually the lower end of revenue. I think that kind of dovetails with all the other things you mentioned, as far as how many chairs, how much square footage, how many dentists, employees. As your revenue goes higher, those are also going to go as well. But it's specifically based on the total overall revenue. And this was a fairly short presentation. I apologize for that. But can we go directly into Q&A? Or you would also want it to speak, I think, before we get to Q&A, about kind of private equity within dental?
Yeah, so there was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday talking about the trend of private equity to acquire physician practices. There's benefits to that, and there's also some concerns. Some states are trying to promulgate legislation that will make it difficult for private equity to acquire physician practice managements and other healthcare firms. So anyway, broad question, how active is private equity in the dental sphere? Is it generally a good thing? Is there opposition to that among politicians, as it addressed in the Wall Street Journal with physicians?
Yeah, I mean, the article didn't specifically mention dental. It talked specifically about overall medical. I know in my experience, there are plenty of groups that do roll-ups and buy out smaller dental practices and then resell them later. I don't think that's an uncommon practice. I don't know how I feel. I mean, I think personal opinion wise, I'm mixed on how I feel about private equity and dental in the first place. It's very similar to in medical, that I feel like private equity companies, I wouldn't want making the rules for any sort of medical decisions. I think dental companies and medical in general don't make their decisions based only on finance. Their main concern is going to be the care of the patient first. And I feel like private equity groups, just because they're private equity groups, are the complete opposite. They're making every decision based on only on the bottom line. So I think my concern would be that if dentists aren't, when they're selling their practices, if they're not careful who they're getting into business with, then you could see a huge negative effect on like the care of the patients for dental in general, right? Same with medical. But I'm sure there are also a lot of private equity groups that are much more tailored to wanting to make sure that the quality of care at the dental practices that they purchase continues to be what it was before they purchased it. If nothing else, because that's really where the profit is going to come from. That's where patient loyalty comes from. So I think it could go either way. I think it could be beneficial if they're not going in and trying to make medical decisions of any sort, and they're not trying to go in and cut absolute necessary costs. It's one thing to kind of rein in spending on overtime or certain types of dental supplies or office space. I think once you start getting into not wanting to pay your providers, not wanting to pay your employees well, or things of that nature, I think that's when you could start seeing suffering quality of care, and then business that's not doing nearly as well as before when it wasn't private equity.
Mm-hmm. Can dental practices make any significant revenue from ancillary sales? You know, sometimes they try to get you to buy a water pick or, you know, a new kind of toothpaste or something like that. You know, is there reason for that? It seems a little bit annoying, and you can't. I don't think it could be that profitable for a practice, but
no, it's never going to be a significant portion of your revenue. I think if anything, if you're selling products that will make your patients healthier, that's something. But as far as like aggressively trying to push them, you can get most of those exact same products at any store, and I think even just recommending them would be about the same without the need to have a large amount of inventory sitting in your offices. I think a lot of times people aren't going to buy directly from a dental office anyway. I know I don't see a lot of dental offices with huge amounts of revenue from those types of products. I don't think it's a bad idea, but I guess it depends on how much you want to deal with.
You mentioned the word inventory. That makes me think of a situation. So sometimes dentists have inventories of amalgams or, you know, material that goes on your teeth or in your mouth, and they have expiration dates. So does a dentist have to be careful that he's managing his inventory appropriately and not, you know, putting in one's mouth a material that has expired?
Absolutely, if nothing else, because that's a liability issue. If you're giving, I mean, just like a doctor, doctors don't directly hand out medication, but giving anything with an expired date, I think, opens you up for lawsuits, and also again, going back to quality of care, it's not going to be real good. So you do want to be real careful with your inventory management on anything that has expiration dates. That being said, on the things that don't have expiration dates, there's plenty of opportunity to buy in bulk and save money. I had a dental practice, it was an ortho practice, that bought 18 months worth of brackets for their ortho practice. And it saved them, I think, 20-30% overall. Now, again, they have to have the cash to do it, but those are things that don't expire, and that's definitely a good opportunity to do something good in inventory management that can save you some cash.
Is there any generality as far as which kind of practice gets higher multiples? Is it the cosmetic work, you know, because you don't have to deal with third-party payers, or is it the, you know, more stability with an office that doesn't do much cosmetic work, but, you know, does more preventative and necessary urgent work can't be avoided?
I think the more multiples are just really still going to be concentrated on the size of the practice. I don't see super high multiples or much different multiples from one practice to another. I know ortho is typically valued, from what I've seen at least, ortho practices are valued higher than general dentistry. That's because a lot of times the margins are a little bit better in ortho than they are in general.
I think maybe the last question, if a dentist is looking to sell his practice and he turns to somebody like you, what kind of timeline should he look at? How much, you know, before he wants to make the sale should he contact you? And what are you going to want to see from him? You know, the financial records. You're going to want to see a business plan or something like that.
I think my overall runway for a sale, for an exit, is I think my ideal one would be 5 years. And that would be on the decision, okay, I'm going to sell the practice in 5 years, and retire or do something else or whatever you're going to choose to do. And I would say engaging a firm like ours or someone else as soon as possible, because the big part of this is the prep. If you're looking at a 5-year runway, that means you can use the first 2.5 years to really prepare your firm to, one, not be completely dependent on you, to get rid of the part of the key person risk. And you can also start tracking the things that you need to improve to be ready for that sale. You can take a hard look at your technology, make sure that it doesn't need to be a big upgrade before you get to the point where you're actually going to sell, if it's a necessary thing or not. You can start looking for the type of person that you want to sell to. Buying a dental practice is a pretty big purchase. So meeting that person and negotiating is going to take some time. You want to make sure they fit in with your practice, that they have the kind of experience and, bedside manner, I guess chairside manner, that kind of matches what your patients already expect. So I want to say a runway total of 5 years before you plan to exit, and contacting someone like our company to do these things for you within the first year or two to start getting that prep going, and then really start advertising that you're going to sell it and finding that person. And then beyond that, there's really the choice. How long are you going to work at the practice after that? How long are you going to assist? How long does the new person need to get in and kind of build that trust with your patients to make sure your employee retention is as high as, or your patient retention is as high as possible? So yeah, I'd say 5 years is kind of the ideal runway overall.
Okay, a final follow-up question. Should a dental practitioner, office manager, should they have their financials audited, reviewed, collated, or just having tax returns?
You definitely, I'd say not reviewed, probably not to the level of reviewed or audited. You want to have good financial records prepared by a CPA, I think at the very least. So like a compilation report or a management report. Most practices, simply because of the revenue involved, probably don't need to get up to the level of a reviewed or audited statement. And I think you shouldn't. It's quite expensive and probably isn't going to bring you back much value. That being said, once you get into the negotiating process, the buyer is going to do their own due diligence anyway. They're going to request certain documents from you, which include your tax returns and internal financial statements, payroll, whatever else, operating agreements, that they want to take a look at to make sure that your numbers are legit. But I would definitely go for a compilation at the very most. I really don't think a review or an audited statement is necessary for a small company.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, James, for speaking to us again and answering all these questions and enlightening us on what dental practitioners should do to position their businesses for sale. So that was great session.
No problem at all. Thank you very much again for having me.
Our pleasure. Okay, so that concludes today's conference. We very much appreciate your interest and attendance and the questions you sent us. All great. We hope to see you at future Davos in the Desert conferences.